First things first, I hope you do get this in front of a real ensemble, because it's a nice piece of music. Okay, first violins, the first notes. Is that divisi? Non-divisi? Better to mark it, right? Okay, tutti. The first 3 bars are under 1 bow stroke. No, not at this tempo. You can't just you can just bow it per bar, and you'll get the crescendo you want as well in bar 2. That notwithstanding, the violins should be tied in the original bowing, that F sharp. Same thing with the second violins, that B, and the violas should be tied with that G if you're going to keep your original bowing. So anyway, the diminuendo to a pianissimo is unnecessary. I'm not a big fan of ending dynamics anyway. Did it specifically need to go to that instead of al niente or instead of pianissimo where you're going to start? It's just too much shit clouding up the page. It's not necessary. In general, a dynamic placed under a rest is something I see a lot, and that's technically incorrect because nobody's playing on the rest. So it happens later in the piece as well. But anyway, just get rid of them. The diminuendo's fine. But in general, these look like dynamics for samples for MIDI instead of dynamics for people. Yeah, whatever. Okay, starting on an up bow in bar 4 will help dynamics a lot. The dynamics you want, anyway. What it won't help is the phrasing at this tempo, the bowings again. I'd say bow the first 3 notes, D, E, F sharp, and violin 1 on an up bow, and the rest should be all right. In general, I'm not a fan of double-dotted quarter notes followed by a 16th rest. Double-dotted notes are weird anyway. It's readable here because the tempo is slow enough, so there won't be a mistake, but in another context, it could be confusing. It might be better to write a quarter note tied to a dotted 8th, and then the 16th rest. Okay, cellos, bar 7. Is this A and E? Is that non-divisi? Better mark it. All right, measure 11. Everyone is on an up bow at that pianissimo, which is a bit counterintuitive to have a diminuendo on an up bow, but it's not impossible. Just be aware of it, and maybe you want to adjust the bowings before we get here, so they end down. There are no need in the cellos and basses, that first measure, there's no need to repeat this accidental with parentheses that F natural. If it's printed in the parts, it'll look super ridiculous. Admittedly, it won't. It might not be printed in the parts, but it's not even necessary on the score. Progressive vibrato, that's something that's very weird and crops up a bunch in this piece. I've never heard the term. I think it's a sample term, probably. Some samples that are labeled progressive vibrato. That's what most players will do anyway, start out without vibrato and then go to vibrato on individual notes, but certainly at this tempo, that's what they'll do. Nobody's going to hit it with a lot of vibrato right away. What you could do is just put vib, but vib is going to be interpreted as meaning more vibrato than you were expecting, than they were going to do anyway. But that progressive, I think you'll get a question about it. Nobody knows what that means. Last bar, the tremolos. They can all be written with 3 beams. There's no need for 5. The only time I would use 4 or 5 would be on a measured tremolo where they actually have to play 64th notes, or in this case, 128th notes, I guess, at an extremely slow tempo. Just do 3. It's universally accepted as being 3 for a tremolo. Are the violin 2, are they divisi? Measure 12, 13, 14, 15. Is that divisi? Mark it. I'm sure this one's just an oversight, but in the violin 2 and cello in the last measure, there's repeated pianissimo dynamics. It must have been for the samples or something. Players don't need that, of course. It would be much more intuitive in the second violins and cello right after the double bar to break those. It goes with your dynamics. Start up, go down. Talking about the E and the C. Hopefully everybody's starting up after the double bar. And finally, the bass harmonic in 13, right after the double bar. That's unclear. Is this a 2-octave harmonic on the A string? It's too quiet. Is it a 12th harmonic on the D string? Might be out of tune. Is it some kind of touch harmonic, like an unnatural harmonic? Notate it then. Notate the note that's supposed to be fingered and the harmonic. Does it repeat 2 bars later? That A that comes back 2 bars later, better to label that repeatedly. String harmonics are deep stuff, and players will always appreciate clarity over just some kind of O above the note, which will be interpreted as, figure it out for yourself, motherfucker. First violins measure 21. Is that divisi? Mark it. In the first violins and the viola, we have those repeated dynamics again in the first measure. Well, first to the second measure. Those repeated pianissimos. Violins, well, I had a lot of notes here, but in general, all of the bowings, 19 to 24, 20, 21, 22, sorry, should be just with the bars. Up on a crescendo, down on a decrescendo, meaning you'd have to break a lot of stuff. Same viola is the same. Yeah, it's in all the strings. Just bow with your dynamics and make it a lot better. Cellos, bar 19. That's a mess. What's divisi? Who's playing what voice? It's unclear to me. Fix it. Tutti in 23. That pianissimo is an ending dynamic. I don't think it's necessary, but I already spoke of that. Violin 1 solo notes in 24. Just start on pianissimo instead of ending pianissimo, the phrase that before that, and giving no starting dynamic. After the ritardando, this più mosso, is that 84? Tempo 84 like it was? Should you mark it? Should you mark some kind of subito tempo after the ritardando? Because, I don't know, it doesn't really look like tempo there. Più mosso, then a ritardando? Or an accelerando? I don't know. Again, these progressive vibrato, but we already talked about that. Con vibrato. After a progressive vibrato. Is that supposed to be more vibrato than normal? I mean, string players are going to generally play with vibrato until you tell them not to. I don't know. The bowings and the phrasing, 28 to 31, it's a mess. Right now there's just some big old bow over everything, including repeated notes. That's strange. I'd say use a dotted phrase marking, but that could be ridiculous for the seconds and the altos because they are repeating the notes. Find some kind of useful bowing here. This is lazy. Bowings at 33. That's the new tempo. You might be able to get 2 bars in a bow stroke, depending on how much faster the più mosso is. But you'll never get the dynamics you want. So maybe the first bar and second bar together, because you're starting up after the diminuendo in 32. And 32 has to be down, because it's diminuendo and slowing down. I think it's got to be down anyway. Right, stop it there. First violins, I get that you want this all on the G string in the middle 3 bars here, but they can't play 2 notes on the G string, so mark this divisi, probably. Probably with two voices, the G going up and the E going down, I guess. Tutti bowings here in those middle three measures, the tempo 60. The first two bars can be bowed up, and the third bar can be bowed down at the mezzo forte. That goes with your dynamics. So, for instance, change the viola to a whole note in 39. Tie those together, the Gs, those Gs. D Gs, D's Gs. Cello and bass, measure 35-36. I suggest finishing on a down bow on the fermata, the E, which would leave you with a pretty unnatural diminuendo on an up bow before that, but I think it's necessary. I think it's a lot more comfortable, and it goes with the starting dynamic at tempo 60 anyway, or the starting bowing, excuse me, at tempo 60 being up. Furthermore, the crescendos at tempo 94, dup, dup, dub, dup, dup. I don't see a need for an ending dynamic. I think it's good the way it is, but if you really want to be specific about it, you should mark that dynamic too, like where does the crescendo go to. These tenuto staccatos that are all over the place, you might get a question about them. They're not accents. They're not played like accents. The samples play them back accented. It just means to play in between a tenuto and a staccato, longer than a staccato, shorter than a tenuto. The triplets at this tempo don't leave a lot of wiggle room either way to shorten them up or fatten them up, put it that way. If you want the stuff to be accented, put an accented tenuto mark, and the length will be played at this tempo like you want. First violins, non-divisi in the first bar, maybe, or divisi. Three other places on the page as well have multiple notes. In the case of the second violins at measure 54, they can't play this non-divisi, so that one's got to get a divisi. It's unclear how far you want to pull back the dynamic, these hairpins in 53. I would mark a dynamic in the middle. You'll get a question about it. What definitely needs to happen is in 54, there needs to be an ending dynamic for that crescendo landing on 54. Also, it's a bit nitpicky, but I'm not a big fan of using the C for common time for a 4/4 measure. I think if it's 3/4/4/4, 3/4/4/4, switching back and forth, it reads easier. If it's 4/4, it might make it easier to understand. It might not make a difference. Like I said, a bit nitpicky. This is very cool string writing here. Sounds great. Oh yeah, one more thing. Fix the cello dynamic in the last measure, so it's coming under the B and not under the rest. And does that mean then that the other mezzo pianos start on that beat as well, instead of an accented mezzo piano? Don't know. Okay, the usual divisi, non-divisi bitching here. This continues for some time. There's no ending dynamic in 58. That's important. That kind of passage has been covered before anyway. Cello, measure 57. That D natural will just make them think too much. The D sharp they had was ages ago. Okay, contrabass. Switching between these snap pizzicati and arco. Mark the arco. It's clearer every time they go back to arco. And again in the bass, what is the difference between the sforzato and a fortissimo on the same note? Sforzato with the double F? Asking for a friend. Okay, is there a dynamic in 64 coming off of that diminuendo? For everybody but the basses, anyway. It's a graphical thing. There's a couple of extra non-vibrato markings in the altos and cellos. Uh, 75 to 76 is just a real nice moment. Okay, the whole page really. Check all the bowings here. Not only is notation a mess sometimes, like the violin 1 slur, 75, and other slurs, they don't go with the dynamics. So check out your bowings here. Violin 1, measure 80, has a diminuendo from a piano dynamic to a piano dynamic. Is that subito piano on 81? I don't know. Is there a tempo after the rallentando? Sounds real steady to me at measure 81. All the bowings here are kind of a mess, and the notation is super sloppy too. If you tie a note, if you slur a note to another note, and that note is tied to something else, the slur goes over all of the notes. Cellos at 81, those 3-note chords. How's that divisit? Of course, properly, you got to know how many players you're writing for, but is the top note perhaps played by one group, and then the bottom 2 notes, the sixth, are those in a, a double stop, played by the other people? Or is it divisit up with 3 voices? Lastly, which bass note is arco? Just a graphic thing. All right, the usual bowing stuff. And break the first 2 bars after the tempo change. You'll get your dynamics a lot better. Down, up on those bars. Also, why is tempo primo marked 60 earlier in the piece and not here? Might be good to mark it again. Again, very nice string writing here. Very cool. I'm gonna complain about the bowings again. No. Where does this ritardando go to? Is there a tempo on the forte? That would be cool. What tempo we be at? And after this ritardando ending in 105, I think, is there a tempo there? Or does the ritardando continue to the end of the piece? The conductor and the players will ask. Bowings, again, if you care about these, you won't leave it up to the player. These notes are too long for one bow stroke. Al niente, the very, very end, going to nothing. I'm not a big fan of that. Some people use a little O. I'm not a big fan of that either. I think it's clear that they're not going to play a decrescendo to mezzo piano or something to end the piece. I just don't think anything's necessary there. What I am a fan of is an empty measure with a fermata in it after playing. It's very clear to everybody to cut off on one and just wait. That's a nice touch. That's a good idea. I meant all of these comments with all due respect to the composer. It's a really nice piece of music, and I hope that it wasn't insulting in the least. It takes balls to put your music online and let everybody hear it. Cool, kudos. And yeah, I hope somebody could learn something about notating for real instruments instead of for samples. And I figure since you bothered to notate it anyway for notation instead of just leaving it samples and audio, that might as well do a good job. Good luck. I hope you get to hear the piece with real humans.